Hello, welcome to my YouTube channel. My name is Alana, and this is my little corner of booktube, if you will. So, in today's video, I am going to be reviewing Outlander by Diana Gabaldon. As you can see, I've got it here. That's the wrong side. And here, because two is better than one. Actually, this is a signed copy, and I just don't like how big it is. The hard copy is just, I have baby hands, and so, is this upside down? I decided to, this is going to be a fun review. I decided to purchase the mass paperback just because it just fits so much better in my hand. I know a lot of people don't like mass paperback editions, but if it's a chunky book, I prefer it to be as petite a size as possible. Same with the Game of Thrones books, because they're heavy and cumbersome, so I prefer to have it as petite as possible. This is not relevant to the book itself. So, this is not my first This is not my first read of Outlander. This is my second read of Outlander. The first time I read it was in 2015, and I read the first book, the second book, the third book. There are currently 9 novels in this particular series. There are spin-off novellas, there are short stories, there's a cookbook. There, of course, is the infamous Star Show, which I wish I could now get the mass paperback without this emblem on it, but whatever. There's the infamous show, and all that being said, this story in and of itself, this is a fantastic novel, and I feel like I've appreciated it more this second time around since 2015. This was published in 1990. Yo, this book is about to be 31. This book is really 31 years old. Is it just me, or do you still think the 90s were only 20 years ago? This is going to be a long review. Get a cup of tea, get a snack, get a knitting project, get a sewing project. This is the time to repair the seam that was undone in your pants, something. This is going to be a long review, and the reason why I'm going to really take my time with this review is because, yes, this was published in 1991. There's a hit show based off of this whole series, and it does have the reputation for being a smutty romance. Don't get me wrong, Outlander is a sexy story. However, when you take that away, the story still stands. And so I'm actually going to be focusing on the elements of the book that made this, on my second read, one of my favorite books, one of my current favorite books of all time, which is a video I just posted last week if you want to go back and watch that. Diana Gabaldon in this series really asks a lot of interesting questions. Some of those I'm going to get into that are philosophical, moral, and ethical in nature. And I love that kind of thing. So I'm going to structure this outline, giving you guys a brief overview of the book. This will be spoiler free. Then I'm going to go into 3 of the characters, do a little bit of a character study, especially with our main character, Claire. Then I'm going to get into some themes that I noticed that I want to bring to you guys' attention. And then I also am going to talk about Diana Gabaldon as a writer. And then that will be it. Outlander by Diana Gabaldon is the first novel, like I said, of currently 9 novels. And it focuses on our protagonist, Claire Randall. So this particular book is told entirely from Claire's first person perspective. This mass paperback edition is 850 pages long, so you were in her head for 850 pages. I'm going to kind of talk about that quite soon, actually. And her husband are visiting the Highlands of Scotland in Inverness 6 months after World War II has ended. So it's 1945. And they have both served in the war. We never really quite know what Frank did in the war. My guess is that he was in intelligence, so he doesn't or can't talk about it. And Claire was a combat nurse, so she was actually on the field. And post-war, 6 months later, her and Frank go to the Highlands of Scotland as a way to kind of have this second honeymoon, because even though they've been married for 6 to 7 years, they've actually spent more time apart than together. And it's also important that Claire takes up botany post-war, and she studies plants. She studies the medicinal purpose of plants and how they can be applied to medicine. Duh, that's what medicinal practice is, right? Yeah, okay. And so while they're in Inverness, Claire visits this stone circle structure. She touches a stone and she is catapulted back to 1743, which is 2 years before the last Jacobite rebellion. Well, I don't know if you could really call it the last. It's kind of considered by a lot of historians as the last, but it's often also referred to as just 1745 because it completely decimated a lot of these clans. The wearing of tartan was banned. Whole clans were wiped out. So she is leaving one war and kind of entering on the cusp of another. And here she meets a whole slew of characters. Most importantly, she meets Jamie Fraser, who is, it's Jamie. I think that people who don't even know what Outlander is about know that there's probably this guy named Jamie, also thanks to the Star Show, because it's just this massive 6-foot+ red-haired dude on the cover of everything. But anyway, so Claire, upon the time that she's spending in 1743, now has this tension between going back to her own time, to her husband Frank, or staying in 1743 because of Jamie. So I'm going to first talk about Claire as a character, and then I'm going to talk about Frank, and then I'm going to talk about Jamie. Claire, to me, and if I'm looking down, it's because I have my over 2,000 word review that I'm kind of using as my outline, and I will post the link to this down below as well if you want to refer back to it. But Claire is a really fascinating character to me, and on my reread, she was even more fascinating. Claire is very funny. She's very smart. And like I said earlier, this novel is completely told from Claire's first person perspective. And Diana Gabaldon is able to make being in Claire's head very engaging and very entertaining for the whole duration of this novel. Not once did I feel it was tedious. And because you're in somebody's head, Claire's head, and she's giving you what she's thinking, who she's talking to, you don't really know. That is a question I've heard a lot of people pose when they're talking about the Outlander books. Who is Claire writing to or talking to? I don't know. I don't know if that's revealed later in the series. Again, I've only read the first 3 books. But Claire is an unreliable narrator. And I think unreliable narrators in the first person perspective are very realistic, because how many times do we contradict ourselves from one thought to the next within our own heads? So, and if you like an unreliable narrator, you'll probably like Claire, because there are times she's a little bit, it's so obvious that she's saying the exact opposite of what she means. So right when she travels through the stones, of course, her main goal is to get back to her own time and back to Frank. But as time progresses, it's very evident to the reader that drive is waning. And regardless of how much she's telling herself, she wants to get back to 1945 and she wants to get back to Frank. You're like, Claire, do you really though? My girl. Like you getting to know Jamie Fraser. Do you really want to go back to Frank? So, and this is a quote from Claire. I should have got away sooner. I should have tried harder to return. But I reminded myself, I had tried repeatedly. Okay, my girl, okay. What you said. Claire also finds herself in quite a bit of precarious situations. And Diana Gabaldon does a really, really good job subtly indicating how Claire is coping with these events. So yes, like I said, this is a sexy novel. This is also a graphic novel in that it's violent, very violent at times. So if that bothers you, you might want to not read Outlander, but it might just not be the story for you. I admit, sidebar, I admit I have a very, very high tolerance for violence. Very high tolerance. I have a high tolerance for really difficult content as well. And insert difficult, anything that's considered really hard to stomach content, I have a very high tolerance for. The only thing I don't have a tolerance for is horror for some reason. But other than that, I'm relatively almost unbothered by graphic content. But if that bothers you, run away. But so yes, Claire does experience quite a bit of trauma in this book. And there are other characters that deal with a lot of trauma in this book. And like I said, Diana Gabaldon does an excellent job subtly showing us how Claire decides to cope with this, or whatever way her brain switches between what I call hysterical Claire and clinical Claire. So hysterical Claire is pretty, my sleeve keeps falling down. Hysterical Claire is pretty easy to detect. She literally just, in the most inappropriate situations after a traumatic event, she'll just bust out laughing hysterically, or she just has this inappropriate sense of humor that's just ill-timed, but it's because she's in shock or something, and that's just, she just snaps. Then there's clinical Claire, which is the, as you can probably guess, is the exact opposite. She kind of shuts down. She becomes very monotone and flat, and she reverts to her medical training. And she starts to view everything through this medical lens, especially if it's a situation where something that happened, somebody gets injured. She just goes right into, I'm on the battlefield in World War II, and I need to help my patient. And everything else is shut down, and then she'll process those things later. So I just think that it's really interesting that Diana Gabaldon does this, and it makes Claire a very dimensional character. And it also makes analyzing Claire, if you like character studies, very fascinating as well. Another thing that I will mention is that, I will say, let me go back and say, hysterical Claire is a lot easier to detect than clinical Claire. Clinical Claire, because Claire already has a medical background, sometimes you can't quite catch immediately if she's going into one of these clinical episodes where she's trying to cope with the horrible situation, or is she just being logical and realistic. So again, if you like character studies, if you want to take your time and go through those scenes, I think it would be interesting to do, which is why this book is annotated the way it is. The last thing I'll mention about Claire is how many names she has in this novel. It's extremely important which name is being used by another character, or which name Claire is using towards herself. So when she's having this internal monologue, she may call herself Claire. She may call herself Mrs. Randall. What she only does once in this whole book, she refers back to her married name once. And Mrs. Beecham, which is the alias that she takes on, which was her maiden name. She takes on that name when she travels through the stones, because of course at this time she can't really tell people that she's from 200 years in the future. They might think that she's crazy, especially in 1700s. But so she's known as Mrs. Beecham. Again, like I said, Claire, or the infamous Sassenach, which means Outlander. And how Sassenach is used is also very deliberate. It can be an insult, or when it's spoken by Jamie Fraser, it's a bit of a friendly pet name. So again, in how each name is used, the context in which it's used is all extremely important. And again, it's just something that Diana Gabaldon does well. And you can tell a lot by the tone of the conversation that may be happening between two characters, or how Claire is referring to itself, Diana Gabaldon will use just a name or a switch of a name to tell you everything you need to know about that conversation. And again, that's very, very smart writing. I'm going to step away from Claire and I'm going to move on to Frank briefly. So Frank is Claire's husband. He makes a very brief appearance in Outlander, and it's only in the beginning of the novel because Claire goes back into time very, very, very early on in the plot of the novel. However, we're given just enough about Frank to allow us, the reader, to create this distinction between Jamie and Frank, but also enough of how Claire and Frank interact to kind of get this idea of what their relationship may or may not be like. So Frank, there's nothing wrong with Frank. I think that readers tend to have this propensity to want to compare and contrast characters too much. Just because Claire has this internal conflict between Frank and Jamie, we kind of pick teams, if you will. Team this, team that. But there's nothing wrong with Frank. Frank is a nice man. He may be a little bit dry, academic, and boring. I mean, he's a professor. Not saying that professors are boring, but he is your classic Oxford man. He is an academic. He's a little bit more reserved. He's a bit aristocratic. And Frank and Claire do love one another, but they may not really be the best matched couple. They have a comfortable marriage. They get along. It's a little bit easygoing in some ways. It's relaxed. They humor each other, even though Frank isn't really into what Claire is into, and Claire isn't into what Frank is into, but they get along anyway, and they appreciate those differences within each other. But there is nothing intense about their relationship. It's just comfortable, which I think is really realistic. Most people's marriages or relationships, it's comfortable. They're content, especially if you've known somebody for several years. There's an ease and maybe something predictable about the way that the relationship kind of gets on. However, Claire is not reserved. Claire has a potty mouth. Claire is rambunctious. There's a scene where she embarrasses Frank in front of somebody, and he tries to cover it up by just correcting her, or it's kind of an awkward scene, to be honest. It's supposed to be awkward, but right there, you kind of see that there's something stuffy about this environment that she's in the 1940s. And ironically, Claire's rambunctiousness is better suited for the ruggedness of the Highlands in 1743. And the Scottish companions that she hangs out with, because these guys are funny and they're a little crazy. So now we're going to go on to Jamie very briefly. Jamie is our lead male protagonist. And he is one of those fictional men that since this book, and especially I think since the series, since I will say that I think that the show cast Jamie perfectly with Sam Heughan, he is now deemed like the manliest of men, the man of all men, you know what I mean? He's tall and buff and young with amazing red curly hair and high cheekbones and a good jaw. I mean, like, he's just your classic romantic hero. And so in that way, he's really the exact opposite of Frank. Both are handsome, just different types of handsome. And where Frank is lean and aristocratic, Jamie is solid and rugged. I like to use the term beefcake versus cupcake. You know what I mean? They're both delicious, but different. Jamie is exuberant. He's comical. He's kind. He's a warrior. He's been trained with, he's a man he is a Highlander. He has his family. He comes from a pretty well-to-do family, but he does have academic training, which would be considered good academic training for this time period. He knows his Latin. He's learned the ancient classics, such as the Greeks and the Romans, but he also knows how to be a warrior during this time period. And, what I like most about Jamie is that he tends to find the most humor, or not, that's a weird way to phrase this. Jamie will find humor in any situation that he's in. Even, because even Jamie goes through in this novel. And there are times where he just cracks a joke to lighten the mood. And sometimes I think he's doing it for the sake of other people than he is for himself. He's trying to lighten other people's unease or worry about him. And I think that's really his best quality. Now, Jamie and Claire have an instant chemistry, as you could probably guess, just because this novel really is about Jamie and Claire's relationship. And they have that type of relationship or bond where they can look at each other from across the room, make a gesture, tap somebody on the shoulder, and they're speaking without words. And Diana Gabaldon does this in a way that is not cringy. Because it can be pretty. I'm not a huge romance novel reader. I don't mind romance in a novel, but I prefer a lot of other elements in my story, like, whatever. I love a lot of other elements to be kind of taking place around a central relationship, instead of just, it always has to be about these two people coming together, which again, Diana Gabaldon does really well, because I would really classify this. Well, I don't know. I'll get into that a little bit later. What is this genre? What is the genre of this book? I'm a little all over the place. Let's focus. But yeah, she does it in a way, she constructs the chemistry between Jamie and Claire in a way that is not cringy. Now, I will say there are some scenes, as I said, this is a sexy novel. In some of those scenes, I was like, that's definitely written in the 1990s. There's a vibe to it. So maybe that would be like, that may be a little dated. But again, being a person who doesn't read a lot of romance novels, maybe it's just me. We're going to move on. So let's talk about the world of Outlander. So Outlander is a world that's set in a time... Outlander takes place in a world in which time travel is possible. So this book, the first book, does remain rather vague about what those rules are, who can and cannot time travel. Diana Gabaldon starts to, drop some breadcrumbs, but the entirety of what this world consists of and what the rules are, you're not exactly sure yet. And granted, I don't really know what happens in books 4 through 9. I do know that in the second, especially the third book, she starts to kind of piece some of these puzzles together. But as of this book, you're not really sure what all the rules are. But it does allow for some mystical realism to happen in the world of Outlander. So some things just are. And Claire encounters a water horse and a loch. There are stories of fairies and changelings. And as you can imagine, this is the Highlands of Scotland in the 1740s. So there's a lot of superstition going on. And people being superstitious is normal for this time period and for these people. Claire, though she is very modern, she can coexist in a historical setting like 1743 and not feel as if the author has put a very modern 20th century person with 20th century ideals in the past, trying to project those 20th century perspectives and cultural norms in a society that makes no sense. Because Claire is modern, she has traveled back in time. She's not going to be, what am I trying to say? Well, I don't know why I'm trying to say it. I have it written right here. So she can coexist in the past with a more modern personality because she literally time traveled. However, because we're also in a world or a universe where there's a bit of magical realism, we meet lots of strange characters. And in the third book, there's some strange characters. In the second book, there's a really interesting French apothecary. And Diana Gabaldon is kind of saying when you exist in a world in which space and time and people's places in space and time is fluid, strange characters or characters that may seem a little bit odd for their time are not out of place. That's what I'm trying to say. She's not trying to project a modern mindset on the past, which is what a lot of historical fiction falls prey to, and it bothers me. As a person who was a history major, stop it. Okay, we study and read about the past to know about what they thought, not what we want them to think. What's really interesting is that Claire will embrace some of the things that happen in this world and then reject others. So she'll totally acknowledge that she traveled through time. It does take her a while to kind of accept it, but she does eventually accept that this is a thing and that this happened to her. And she accepts that she saw a water horse. But when it comes to discussions of witches and fairies and changelings, she's like, girl, what? I want no parts of it. And I just think that that's really strange. I don't know if it's a way of her to try to preserve what little understanding she has of the world at this point. But I think that is fascinating. But she does start to say, and here's a quote from her, I thought of the amber eyes of the water horse and wondered which others were true. So again, I don't know if her kind of pushing some of these things away is a defense mechanism, because your girl traveled through a stone and she's probably feeling some type of way about the fact that she traveled through a stone. There are 5 themes or points that I want to discuss most about this book. The main one being about fate and how world events or the world or events within the world will orchestrate themselves to ensure that what is supposed to happen happens. This is seen mainly, of course, with Jamie and Claire. You have these 2 people who have such an interesting bond. They have immediate chemistry. They seem as if they were meant for each other. This is taking place in a universe to ensure that these 2 people got together. This is also, Diana Gabaldon also starts to pose this question because you have a person who's gone back in time, and it raises this question of, what has this got to do with history? And can history be changed or not? Or are there just some things that are destined to happen? So that leads me to the second point, which is the weight of knowing. Claire, being from the future, knows how devastating the 1745 will be. And she's wrestling with this concept of, how do I process this? I've made friends with these people who are Klansmen. Do they really know they don't really know what's going to happen to them in 2 years? Should I warn them? The second book kind of gets a little bit more into that. A lot of the first book actually sets up the stage for the second book. And so Claire asks herself, or she's really talking to herself. She says, being a prophet is a very uncomfortable occupation. I thought not for the first time. I felt considerable sympathy with Jeremiah and his limitations. I also realized exactly why Cassandra was so unpopular. This also made me ask personally, if Diana Gabaldon is starting to set up future characters in some of the books I haven't read yet, maybe characters who are considered prophets or prophetesses in some of these other books, if they pop up, if they're people from the future. I don't know the answer to that. That's just something that I'm sticking a pin in. And great thing about these themes is that they all kind of mesh together. So then the third thing, which is a theme that is a question that Diana Gabaldon raises, not just in this book and in future books, is, what are the moral and ethical responsibilities of the time traveler? Does a person have a right to try and manipulate the past / tamper with history for a more favorable outcome? Diana Gabaldon begins to play around with these questions, and it gets more explored in depth, like I said, in the sequel, Dragonfly and Amber. But if you are a person who's fascinated by history and people's places in history, and how the choices that people make as autonomous beings actually added all together, have a huge impact on history, this is why this book is so great to me. I love those kind of questions, and it's really not an easy question to answer. So Claire is having a conversation with somebody, and they're talking about how the choices that we make have significant impacts. And there are some impacts that we don't know how much of an impact they'll have in the future. How are you going to know, right? So This person says, "You say that you're afraid to take any actions here for fear of affecting the future. This is illogical, madam. Everyone's actions affect the future. The only difference is that you may be in a position to see more clearly what effects your actions have, and then again, you may not." So again, that's a really interesting question to me. If we were to go back to, say, World War II in Nazi Germany, people would say, "Oh, well, if I had done this, this wouldn't have happened. Now, because I know what the outcome is, I know how to stop it." But can you really stop it? Once something is set in motion, can you really stop it? Or are you going to make things worse? Again, we always say, "Oh, if we were to time travel, go back in history, we would do this." Would you, or would you have the courage to? So I could go on about that forever, so I'm going to move on. But again, I think that's an interesting topic to talk about, which is another reason why I'm eager to read War and Peace, because I just have a fascination when it comes to people's spaces, the space that they occupy in history, and the choices that they make. Because one thing I'm very big on is personal autonomy, and people taking responsibility for their actions. I'm a big fan of that because I don't think people do it enough. All right. So again, that nicely segues into how people tend to romanticize the past, and Diana Gabaldon has this as a theme throughout the whole novel. Once Claire travels back in time, she begins to realize how romanticizing history results in an incomplete understanding, and sometimes inaccurate understanding, of what life was for those people who were actually living during that period. And here's a quote here from Claire. Again, this is a monologue, or a piece of a monologue. She says, "One never stops to think what underlies romance. Tragedy and terror transmuted by time. Because the more distance that you have between something or a period of time and yourself, the more mythical it seems, the more fuzzy it is around the edges, because you don't have a personal relationship to it. You did not live in that time period, so there's something about it that just seems perhaps a bit whimsical, or unreal. How many times, even when you're looking at or studying the horrible things that have happened in history, you look back and there's just like, "Oh, that would never happen in our time. We know better." There's still this sense of voyeurism a lot of times when it comes to history. And then lastly, which is not about any of these philosophical, moral, or ethical questions that Diana Gabaldon poses when it comes to history and how we talk about history and people's places in history or roles in history, but this is a theme that's very specific to Claire, and it's about Claire's desire for home and permanency. She had a transient childhood, and being a nurse in World War II, that's a different type of upheaval in and of itself, right? And then of course, at the end of World War II, her and Frank are in Inverness trying to set down roots, because they're actually about to move to Oxford. She gets another upheaval. So Claire's always looking for a home. And 1743, Scotland provides more of a home for her than her own time. And right at the beginning of the novel, she's looking forward to a permanent life because she's staring through at a store window, and she's admiring these vases. She's never owned a vase because it was impractical. She never had a place to put a vase. And so right at the beginning of the book, she's admiring these vases, and she goes into the store and she's like, "I'm going to buy these vases." But then again, her life takes another turn. However, this just occurred to me. Her home, in a sense, is it a person or is it a place? Diana Gabaldon, I'm going to talk about her as a writer. So pre the release of this novel, which is her first novel, and I had to research this because I had a hard time believing this was her first piece of fiction. She was a scientific writer. I think she wrote about, I can't remember what kind of, I don't know, was it computer stuff, science, computer science, or biological science, something. She wrote scientific papers and she did scientific research. So I think that's impressive because for her to switch gears and to do something like this, which is the exact opposite, she has the skill. She just has a God-given gift to tell stories. So if you can tell, I'm going to go into why I think Diana Gabaldon is such a good writer. Her writing is vivid. That's the first word that comes to my mind when I think about her style of writing. Every detail is deliberate and precise. Nothing is wasted. Even if you think something is wasted, it's not wasted. Some things pop up in other books. This is why the second read of this book for me was better than the first. And I enjoyed it the first time. But she dropped so many breadcrumbs. And she uses a lot of symbolism, specifically for Claire, for various things. But in this particular book, she does a lot of symbolism to portray to the reader the difficulty that Claire is feeling or having getting back to her own time, whether that's mentally, emotionally, or physically. So there is a quote here. Claire is a bit drunk. She says, "The fly had found its way back to the puddle and was floundering in the middle, hopelessly mired. My gaze phased on the tiny green spot, which seemed to pulsate as the fly twitched and struggled. Brother, you haven't got a chance." Claire is the fly. And on my first read of this, I probably would be like, yeah, that's really great. That's really great writing. But she sprinkles those little sentences and descriptions in throughout the novel. And it just, she doesn't elaborate. She just puts that sentence in there and lets you figure out the rest. Diana Gabaldon uses a storytelling method that often is referred to as a three beat. I actually think it's easier to detect three beats in TV shows or movies because you have a visual, and I think it's easier to connect the dots when you're seeing something visually than when somebody's dropping breadcrumbs with words, especially when there are no pictures. But I never caught on any three beats in this book until I read it the second time. And so in a nutshell, a three beat is when the same theme, the same imagery or event occurs three times, typically within an episode, or within a movie or within a book. And it's really showing the development or the arc of something that's significant in the span of the novel, show, or movie. There is a three beat in this novel with wolves. And the first time, I don't consider this a spoiler. I'm not going to go too much into it because I'm actually still figuring out what I think it means, but it is significant. Like I said, Diana Gabaldon wastes nothing. So there is a scene where she hears wolves howling in the distance. There's the second time, she's in the woods somewhere and she makes eye contact with the wolf at a distance. You know that this is a female wolf. And the wolf doesn't bother her, it just walks away or turns away. And then the second time, Claire gets into an altercation with a wolf. And there's this whole dramatic scene with this last beat with the wolf. And I've heard other readers of this book complain about that scene, saying it's bizarre, it makes no sense. Why did she do it? Diana Gabaldon wasted 20 pages. It didn't take 20 pages, but it was a whole scene with a wolf. It might have even been a whole chapter, so maybe it was 20 pages. Why I think it's bizarre. It was a waste. It was just unrealistic. This whole book is unrealistic, people. She traveled through a stone. But when I read it the second time, I was like, no. Diana Gabaldon was dropping breadcrumbs the whole time. She was just waiting for you to pick up what she was putting down. And then I think I'm picking it up. But if anybody read Outlander, I need to know what you think the wolf, especially in the third beat, represents. I really need to know because I have some theories. I think it's really Claire finally confronting something within herself. But I need to have a discussion about it. I'm still pondering this. I'm going to take it down 1,000. Finally, Diana Gabaldon is a master at showing and not telling. Kind of like with the fly quote that I shared. She just leaves that quote there, or she leaves that little passage there about the fly, and then it's like on to the next chapter. What I like about authors who show don't tell is that they're relying on the intelligence of the reader to connect the dots. Don't get me wrong. Like I said earlier, there are some very graphic scenes in this novel, and she will write out every detail. And you're like, my girl, did I need to know all that? And she thought you did because she put it in there. Because then there are, again, scenes where she's incredibly reserved. And it's actually harder to be a reserved writer because, again, you're putting the trust into the intelligence of the reader. And she'll give the reader in certain scenes just enough to figure out what's happening and then fade to black, as I like to say. George R.R. Martin does this well, too, in the 2 books that I've read of his Song of Ice and Fire. There is actually a really intelligently written and touching scene where Claire and another character are looking into a room and overhearing conversation that's happening between Jamie and somebody else. And they're actually talking about these 2 women, Claire and the other person. Even though we are in Claire's head, Diana Gabaldon never lets us know what Claire is thinking. We don't get Claire and this other person exchanging looks. Like, are you hearing what I'm hearing? You don't get anything. You just get this conversation. And that section blew me away. I actually highlighted the whole part because the amount of restraint it takes for a writer to do that. Here it is. I highlighted from here and then on to the second page, and I wrote this whole paragraph. And you don't need to know what Claire is feeling, even though you're in your head. How you feel reading it is what Claire feels. And I just thought that was very intelligent, very restrained, and very mature for Diana Gabaldon to do. I do not like it when authors overwrite, because it's just like, do you think that I'm dumb? Do you think that I don't know how to connect the dots? I don't like it when people they have to spell everything out for you. I'm like, bro, I have a brain. I have more than 2 brain cells I can rub together. I can figure out the rest, right? But Diana Gabaldon never insults the intelligence of her reader. If you can't tell, and if you didn't watch my previous video talking about my top 10 favorite books, I love this book. I love me. Clearly, I got 2 copies of it. Thank you for sticking along with this very long review. I hope you enjoyed it. Even if you don't like Outlander, even if you have no intention of ever reading it, I hope that you found this interesting to talk about, as we kind of talked about some of these topics and themes that are presented in this book. So yeah, my second reread of Outlander made it into my favorite books, top 10 of all time currently. I think I just love a smart, evocative, well-told story where the plot's engaging, the characters are engaging. And again, I like that I can't put Outlander in a box. Is it a romance? Yes. Is it sci-fi? Yes. It's also historical fiction. It's also general fiction, which within the first, I think, 10 years of the book, it was placed under the romance category. And then now they just put it in general fiction because, especially as I've heard, as the series goes on, it gets more and more character heavy, and there you explore as a reader more spaces in time and history. So I like that it's just not a cookie cutter genre. And it also makes me ask the question, why are we obsessed with putting things in categories when it comes to books? Because a lot of them straddle lines. But again, there's so much for the reader to invest in, even if you're not a romance reader. I think that you could easily bypass some of those sexy scenes and just enjoy the ride. Even though this is a book that, yes, you can definitely pick up and be whisked away in, and just, it's pure escapism. But again, because Diana Gabaldon is so smart, and she's such a smart writer, if you're in the mood to really analyze, this will, suit both of those needs. This book, after I finished it, gave me a serious hangover. And up next, after I finished it, I had to wait about a week just to finish processing my thoughts. And then I picked up Swan's Way by Marcel Proust. And I'm glad I did that because Swan's Way is a complete 180 from Outlander. Just very enjoyable, but just, of course, very different. It was very difficult for me not to pick up Dragonfly and Amber for a reread. I have it here. I have the third book. I have the fourth book, which I have not read. Now, after the second read, I plan to read all of the 9 novels. Maybe she'll publish a 10th. I don't know. I had no intention of doing that a few years ago after I finished reading the third book. I just wasn't interested in some reason. Now I'm totally invested. And I'm going to wait. If I can get to Dragonfly and Amber this year, I will. If not, I'll just do it next year. But now all of that to say, I am totally committed to this series. Outlander is wild. It's just ridiculous. There are scenes in this series thus far that I've read that is just absolutely ridiculous, and I'm here for it. But I'm going to wrap this up now. Thank you for, again, listening to this appallingly long video. I hope that you were able to hydrate yourself, get something to eat. All of my links are down below, my Instagram, my blog, where you can follow me on both. Please hit the subscribe button and leave me a comment. Greatly appreciated. I am going to wrap this up now.